Hello and welcome to Fridays with Fintelekt. My name is Shirish Pathak. I head Fintelekt, and my guest today is Ravi Lahoti, Chief of Audit at India-based Bandhan Bank, one of the relatively new private sector universal banks in the country, with more than 4,500 outlets and branches and 41,000 plus employees. Ravi was earlier with HDFC Bank, one of India's largest private sector banks, and he is one of the few people in the industry who spent many years in audit, then a few years in AML CFT as the principal officer at HDFC Bank, which gives him a strong perspective of both functions. Ravi, thank you for joining us on this edition of Fridays with Fintelect.
Thank you. Indeed, my pleasure that you have invited me for this particular session. Thank you very much.
So, Ravi, to start with, what would you say is the role of audit in the world of AML CFT?
I think the role prima facie is similar to what audit has in other areas, but yes, there is a specific knowledge on the AML side which is required for any auditor to probably get into the audit of AML CFT, because it's not like normal audit where you go, you identify operational risk, because there are a lot of regulations around AML CFT. So the compliance to those regulations, the knowledge that that person has on those regulations is also very, very important. And a practical area experience of AML, something which I have, gives me an added advantage to understand it from the other side as well. So that's very important, I think.
Right. And Ravi, when you look at the elements of an effective AML audit, how it should be conducted, who should conduct it within the bank, what is your advice to banks on the AML audit side, firstly?
I think first thing that any auditor, specifically in a AML audit, should be aware of is the control environment that is there in the bank. Okay? Because uh, it's a lot to do with the management, how the management looks at AML, the importance that the management gives to AML. It defines the entire control environment in the bank. So that's the first thing that probably an auditor should look at. Being an internal auditor in a financial institution definitely gives that added advantage to the auditor, that he understands the control environment in the bank. Apart from that, some of the key areas of audit for a AML officer would typically be assessment of the risk. And when we say assessment of risk, it does not only mean customer risk, even probably the business risk in terms of the products that the uh, bank has, and also in terms of the geography from where the bank operates, the geography pertaining to the various branches of the financial institution, and not only the branches, probably the customers as well. So when you have NRI customers coming in from the rest of the world to a particular country, the geography risk pertaining to that area also is very, very important. So apart from risk assessment, the other areas which the AML auditor should be fairly conservative with is the FATF regulations, the red flag indicators which the various regulators have prescribed. Okay, so an auditor should not restrict himself to only the red flag indicators which have been prescribed by the regulators of the country in which the auditor is, but world at large, because it gives him a wider perspective to understand the whole thing. Apart from that, there are other areas which are regulatory in nature, like regulatory reporting. The auditor also has to ensure that there is adequate documentation with respect to the AML area. So whether it is the SOP of the AML department or the various things that they do, so he understands, he gets a broad understanding of what all the AML team does, and basis that, I think he can do a much more meaningful job.
Right. And Ravi, so when you get the findings of the AML audit, how do you think they should be really utilized? At what level should they be discussed or reviewed? And how can these findings really be implemented to improve the compliance regime within the bank?
See, one of the things which I strongly feel, and practically I have seen this, that the auditor has an advantage over the AML team as such also, because sometimes these AML, most of the AML teams, you would see are centralized in operation. They are not there at the ground level, whereas the auditor goes to the ground level as well. And we've got real good feedbacks from the auditors at the ground level on certain areas where would not be captured somewhere in the AML system or by configuration of certain alerts. So that is one added advantage which auditor has, and auditor can actually give a very, very meaningful feedback from the ground level, identification of certain cases, and then probably giving that feedback to the AML team at a senior most level, maybe the principal officer, and then the principal officer can look into his own configuration of alerts to see why this alert did not get generated in my system. So that's one area which is very, very important. As the auditor can give feedback. Apart from that, in the regular course of audit, the auditor will also come across certain things which the AML officer will not be looking into, as will be able to look into, like for example, the profilers which the branch maintain, the due diligence which the branch has done for a particular customer, okay, the alerts which have got generated on certain customers. When the auditor goes to a particular unit or a branch or a particular division of the business, then he is able to focus on specified customers, understand the geography, so that if there is a branch which is high cash in nature, the auditor will be able to see it from that angle. Whereas the AML team in general would be looking at a pan country level. So that specific focus and that approach to audit will help the auditor to give that feedback to the AML team. And I think these feedbacks should be discussed at the highest level, maybe the principal officer, as I said, and the review. And the most important thing again would be not wanting to justify. The AML team should not be looking into trying to justify why the alert was not generated, but rather they should look at how we can probably cover this as well in the audit area. Another area which I think the auditor, when the auditor goes to a branch, is doing a larger period review. Most of the alert configurations that we have, even though specified by the regulator, are limited in period. So it will be, say, a week or a month, at max a quarter. I've hardly seen alerts configuration being done at a half yearly or a yearly level. So the auditor gets that perspective and he's able to look at a larger view, the trend that gets formed, and from there also he can be picking up a lot. So if you're doing an audit of AML department at a central level, at the head office, probably the feedback from the ground level auditors is one very important resource for the audit team to probably do an audit of the AML at a central level.
Right. Thanks, Ravi. Ravi, are there any misconceptions that you've come across when it comes to AML audits? Anything that needs to be dispelled?
Misconceptions, I think there are primarily two things which every auditor should understand in terms of the scope for AML audit. I think two things should not be coming in the scope of the auditor. One is the judgment that the AML officer or the principal officer takes in terms of whether a particular case is suspicious or not suspicious. Okay, this is almost similar to how probably a credit audit happens, where we don't challenge the decision of the credit manager. Okay, whether a loan should be given or not should not be given. So there, it's similar to AML. The other area which I think is very, very important is the regulators do prescribe red flag indicators. It is basically the AML team who has to probably manage that red flag indicators along with various thresholds and parameters. So these thresholds and parameters, it's very easy for an auditor probably to go and say that no, the threshold should not be X, it should be X minus 10 or X by 2, thereby increasing the number of alerts, and has a lot of repercussions. So I think if the auditor does not have an understanding of that, it is very easy to recommend downsizing the threshold to increase the number of alerts, thereby leading to a lot of problems like increased false positives and things like that. So that is one area which the auditor should restrain himself. Having said that, yes, if the thresholds are very absurd, then obviously the auditor can question those thresholds. but it should not be like reducing it by 5% or 10%, increasing the number of alerts, and then pointing out to the AML team as an auditor that you've not generated so many alerts which should have been generated, and things like that. So these are the two areas I think broadly which the auditor should not get into too much.
Right, right. Ravi, you spoke a bit earlier about the FATF and also a bit about effectiveness. So, FATF and even the country level regulators recently have been laying a lot of stress on effectiveness versus tick mark compliance or technical compliance. So, how do you think AML audits can actually contribute to to increasing the effectiveness of an AML safety program within the bank?
See, one of the things, as I said, it applies to almost all audits. But again, from an auditor's perspective in the AML, he should have knowledge of the organization in which he is doing audit. When you look into specific areas of audit, say for example, we talked about risk management. Okay, the auditor can actually look at the risk management, identify certain customers who should be classified as high risk but have not been classified as high risk, basically look at the rules and then suggest certain changes in the rules. Okay, we've seen that most of the risk assessment which banks do are very rule based, and the rules are pretty simple in nature. There are a lot of things which the auditor can add value in terms of the risk categorization, even in terms of regulatory reporting, because the AML team again is centralized, sitting in one particular location, and the auditor goes and cuts across various business lines. He understands where the different type of transactions are posted by certain banks. You have multiple systems in the banks. Okay, so we have a classic case of you can say the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, wherein they introduced a system of cash deposit through ATMs, which was used by the money launderers for drug trafficking and even probably human trafficking and these areas. Okay, this feature was added, but the regulatory reporting which is required for cash deposits did not happen because that one particular code, transaction code, did not get added to the regulatory reporting. So I think there the auditor can add a lot of value in terms of what you are missing out in regulatory reporting, because regulatory reporting is more about completeness. So from that aspect, the auditor can definitely look into the regulatory reporting, even in terms of the data quality. So there are certain areas where the data quality is weak, because of which it results into regulatory reporting. We have regulators across the countries asking for improvement in the quality of reporting, which I think the auditor can do a lot better in terms of pointing out the relevant areas which are getting missed out in the regulatory reporting, certain fields which are important for the regulators, which the banks are not reporting. So those inclusion of those fields, linking of those fields, an auditor who works with the data can definitely do a more meaningful job there.
Right. Thanks, Ravi. So, Ravi, in closing, something a bit on the softer side. So, you have been working very closely with the AML safety industry, over the last few years, especially in your previous role, and undertaken many industry initiatives within that. Also, closely with the Banking Association and with other MLROs or principal officers. What is your advice to principal officers, people working in the AML safety functions? What would you say, let's say, the top three things they should do to make themselves successful?
See, one is one area where we've done quite a bit of a work is doing reviews outside the system. So when you have a system, you can have a rule-based configuration for a limited period. But when you do reviews outside the system, it gives you a lot of meaningful cases where the actual money laundering is happening. So to give you an example, probably if I'm looking at some kind of an unusual pattern across the period, okay, the customer is doing only one type of transaction, only the only source of deposit is cash. There's no other transaction in the account which gets transferred after a period. If I look at it over 1 month, then probably it will not give me the kind of suspicion that if I do it over a period of probably 12 months. So similar to that, probably looking at the data from the perspective of, say, scheduled offenses. Okay. So I think earlier we would always think that human trafficking or drug trafficking or things like this is something that can be identified at the ground level and not by the AML team. But now that we have so much of data analytics, so much of AI and ML being used, that targeted reviews can be done in order to ensure that we are able to identify certain things like that if it is happening in your financial institution. Certain other targeted reviews we've done, and those targeted reviews have definitely helped us in identifying cases which would not get identified in the normal course. And one of the other important areas is adding intelligence to the STR that the AML team of a particular bank is filing, because one of the things which we know is that there are high number of STRs which are getting dropped at the level of FIUs, not even getting passed on to the law enforcement agencies, because on a plain reading of the STR, it doesn't give any suspicion. If as a AML team, we are able to add that intelligence into that particular STR, then it will definitely be more useful to the law enforcement agencies. One of the things that we know is that for a AML officer, if you have a reason to suspect, you file an STR. But for a law enforcement agency, they will only investigate a particular case if they have reasons to believe. And it is, I think, the duty of the AML team to bridge this particular gap between the reason to suspect and the reason to believe by adding financial intelligence into that particular STR, into the grounds of suspicion that we write. And for the benefit of everybody to explain this particular thing, if I probably file an STR, and at the time of filing the STR, I say that customer is, to give you an example, probably customer is dealing in timber in the state of Andhra Pradesh, and the particular type of timber that he is dealing in is almost similar to what is smuggled out of Andhra Pradesh, and that probably gives a very, very specific case to the law enforcement agency. Or to give you an example, probably if I file a STR saying that a salaried person has deposited a lot of cash, it may be sounding pretty normal. But if I add that, okay, this salaried person is working with a government department and he is depositing a lot of cash, then it may directly get linked to certain corruption case. So that kind of intelligence we have to add, and this data is available. It's not that this data is not available, but it has to be specifically highlighted. And another thing which is again important is every regulator, every FIU probably prescribes the level of STR, so priority that you have to assign to that particular STR. So if you have a very strong mechanism of giving that priority, then such STRs where you are adding a lot of intelligence should be tagged as priority 1 and filed accordingly, so that the regulator can also give priority to that particular STR.
Excellent. Ravi, thank you so much for those practical inputs. And thank you for joining us today. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.